It is the night of December 27th, 1979. A column of Soviet tanks rolls south across a pontoon bridge over the Amu Darya, the river that has marked the edge of empires for 2,000 years. The water is black. The mountains ahead are blacker still. In one of those vehicles sits a soldier barely 19 years old. He has been told he is going to Afghanistan to help, to guard roads, to protect a friendly government, to be home by spring. He has been told there will be no war. He believes it. Most of them do. Hundreds of miles to the south, in a mud-walled village high in the mountains, an Afghan family sleeps under the same cold stars. Farmers who have never heard the name of the man in Moscow who has just decided their fate. By morning, the two of them will be enemies. Neither knows it yet, but they are walking into a war that will last 9 years, swallow a generation, and help bring down an empire. This is how it began. To understand that night, you have to go back to Moscow and to a decision made by a handful of old men behind closed doors. In April 1978, communist officers seized power in Afghanistan in a bloody coup. Their new government tried to drag a deeply traditional, devoutly Muslim country into revolution overnight, and the country rose against them. By 1979, the revolution was devouring itself. Its leader, Nur Mohammad Taraki, was smothered to death on the orders of his own deputy, a ruthless, unpredictable man named Hafizullah Amin. In the Kremlin, a circle of aging leaders watched with alarm. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, KGB chief Yuri Andropov, and defense minister Dmitry Ustinov feared losing a friendly state on their southern border, and they no longer trusted Amin. The Soviet army's own top generals warned them not to go in. They were overruled. And so, in secret, the order was given: remove Amin, install an obedient man in his place, and steady the country with a limited contingent of troops. They expected a swift surgical operation. Instead, they had lit a fire that would burn for 9 years. It began with a lie and a banquet. For weeks, Soviet advisors had moved freely around Hafizullah Amin's fortified palace on a hill above Kabul. On December 27th, Amin hosted a lavish lunch, and his Soviet doctors, who were not in on the plot, had to fight to save his life after he collapsed, poisoned at his own table. That evening, as the drug wore off, the assault began. Soviet KGB commandos, the elite Alpha and Zenith groups, backed by a specially raised Muslim battalion in Afghan uniforms, stormed the Tajbeg Palace. The fighting was point-blank and brutal. In a little over 40 minutes, it was over. Hafizullah Amin lay dead. The Soviets had killed the very leader they had been protecting only days before, and lost men of their own, including the colonel who led the charge. Across the city, Soviet airborne troops seized the radio station, the ministries, the airport. By dawn, Moscow belonged to Afghanistan. A new ruler, Babrak Karmal, was flown in from exile and announced over the radio, his revolution arriving quite literally on the back of a foreign army. The invasion had taken a single night. The war would be the longest in Soviet history. At first, it looked easy. The Soviet 40th Army poured across the border, tanks, artillery, and tens of thousands of men. They took the cities, the airfields, and the great highway that ringed the country. On a map in Moscow, Afghanistan was conquered. But Afghanistan is not a map. It is a wall of mountains and deserts the size of Texas, cut by valleys where outsiders had been swallowed for centuries, by the British Empire twice, and by Alexander before them. The Soviets held the cities and the roads by day. The countryside belonged to someone else. In the villages, the call went out for jihad, holy war against the godless invader. Farmers, shepherds, and tribesmen took down rifles, some left from fighting the British a century before, and went up into the hills. They called themselves the Mujahideen, those who struggle. They had no tanks and no air force. They had the mountains, their faith, and a refusal to be ruled. And they were prepared to bleed as long as it took. What followed was a war with no front line and no end. Soviet helicopter gunships, the dreaded Mi-24, which the Afghans called the Shaitan Arba, Satan's chariot, hunted the valleys. Armored columns ground through passes like the Salang, where a single ambush could turn a mountain road into a graveyard of burning trucks. Again and again, the Soviets launched massive offensives into rebel strongholds, no more famous than the Panjshir Valley, north of Kabul. There they met a young commander named Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Lion of Panjshir, who would let the armor roll in, then close the valley behind it and bleed it from the heights. The Soviets took the valley by day and lost it by night. They took it 9 times. 9 times Massoud took it back. Unable to defeat the fighters, the war turned on the people who sheltered them. Villages were bombed and emptied, fields and irrigation channels destroyed. By the war's end, a third of the entire Afghan population, more than 5 million people, had fled across the borders. It had become the largest refugee crisis on Earth. The war in the mountains had become the front line of the Cold War. To the United States, the Soviet invasion was a chance to hand Moscow its own Vietnam. Through the CIA's largest covert operation in history, weapons and money flowed to the Mujahideen, funneled through Pakistan, paid for in part by Saudi Arabia, and swelled by volunteers from across the Muslim world. For years, the rebels' greatest terror was the gunships that owned the sky. Then, in 1986, the Americans sent a single weapon that changed everything. The Stinger, a shoulder-fired missile a man could carry up a mountain. Suddenly, the Satan's chariots were falling out of the sky. The Soviets could still win any battle they chose to fight, but they could not win the war. Every year, the coffins kept coming home, and the men who survived came back changed to a country that barely wanted to hear what they had seen. In Moscow, a new leader had taken power. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev, and he had begun to call Afghanistan something no Soviet leader had dared say aloud. He called it a bleeding wound. By the mid-1980s, the truth was impossible to hide. The Soviet Union had sent its sons, most of them conscripts barely out of school, into a war it could not win and could not admit it was losing. They came home in sealed zinc coffins, the soldiers grimly nicknamed Cargo 200, flown back to villages across the Union, sometimes with orders not to say where the dead had died. Those who lived carried wounds no one could see, a generation that came to be known simply as the Afghansi, the Afghans, their voices later gathered by the writer Svetlana Alexievich. Behind the Kremlin walls, even the generals admitted it. Marshal Sergei Akhrameyev told the Politburo plainly, "There is no piece of land in this country that has not been occupied by one of our soldiers, and yet the majority of the territory remains in the hands of the rebels." There was nothing left to win. Gorbachev made the decision the old men before him could not. The army was coming home. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldiers drove north out of Afghanistan, back across a bridge over the Amu Darya, where it had all begun. The commander of the 40th Army, General Boris Gromov, climbed down and walked the final stretch on foot, by tradition the last man out. Halfway across, his young son was waiting. There were no bands and no banners. They simply went home. Behind them, they left a broken country and a war that did not end. Afghanistan would collapse into civil war, and from that wreckage, in time, would rise the Taliban. The cost was almost beyond counting. Around 15,000 Soviet soldiers were dead. More than 1 million Afghans, most of them civilians, were gone. 5 million more would never see their homes again. And barely 2 years after the last tank crossed that bridge, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. Somewhere, a man who had crossed into Afghanistan as a boy